Yeah, I mean, again, calling in from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Nome, Alaska. Hi, Nome. All over the world. It's just amazing. Yeah. No.
The Vatican.
Huh? Yeah, well, we're not quite there yet. All right, so a couple of articles, and just so much going on right now, as we say every week. It's kind of hard to keep up with things happening at such a breakneck pace. But I wanted to start out, and I was a little reluctant to read this one because it might sound a little bit extreme, but I think it's worth listening to, and we can come to our own conclusions as to what's being said here. But I have several articles regarding Israel because that's becoming a real hotbed of activity over there. But this article, the first one I want to go through, is entitled "Mainstream Economists Are Struggling to Hide the Incoming Economic Collapse." And that's a word that they're using now, collapse. So let me just go through it. And again, I've read a lot of this guy's work, and I think he's pretty well on, but in some cases he might be speculating a bit. But anyway, let's see what he has to say. He says, "For many years now, there has been a contingent of alternative economists working diligently with the liberty movement to combat disinformation being spread by the mainstream media regarding America's true economic condition. Our efforts have focused primarily on the continued devaluation of the dollar and the forced dependence on globalism." We've heard a lot about globalism over the course of the last several months. "That has outsourced and eliminated most U.S. manufacturing and production raw materials." And this shortage thing, I'm not sure we're getting the full scoop on that, but it's pretty serious in terms of supply chain and prices going up and so on and so forth. The mainstream media's claim has always been that the Federal Reserve Board, quote, "saved the U.S. from imminent collapse and that the central bankers are heroes. After all, stock markets have mostly skyrocketed since quantitative easing, QE, was introduced during the credit crash, and stock markets are a measure of economic health," right? So everybody knows what quantitative easing is. That's simply the printing of money and infusing it into the system. And so it's what many refer to as fiat or fake money that has been keeping us afloat, I think, for the better part of the last decade or so. "Reality isn't a mainstream media story. The U.S. economy isn't the stock market. The U.S. economy in particular is extremely vulnerable right now. Money created from thin air by the Fed was used to support failing banks and corporations, not just here in America, but also banks and companies around the world." That gets back to that period of time in 2007, 2008 when we had to, and it was a good ploy at the time. It basically saved the economy, but it's just continued ever since. "Because the dollar has been the world reserve currency for the better part of the past century, the Fed has been able to print cash with wild abandon and mostly avoid inflationary consequences." And now, of course, we have this new infrastructure bill, another $1.9 trillion, and hopefully this other bill, the Build Back Better bill, won't pass, but that's just going to make things infinitely worse. "The dollar's global reserve status means dollars are likely to be held overseas in foreign banks and corporate coffers to be used in global trade. However, there's no such thing as a party that goes on forever. If the dollar is devalued too much, whether by endless printing of new money or by relentless inflationary pressures," and it seems like we have both of those going on, at home, all those overseas dollars will come flooding back into the U.S. The result is an inflationary avalanche, a massive injection of liquidity exactly when it will cause the most trouble. It's exactly what we read about in Revelation 6 that we've talked about so many times, is the infusion.
One thing that I learned and I was shocked about, the money that they're printing, there is no money. So they put out a bond. Because it's at zero, nobody will buy it. So we are keeping these bonds at zero. And we're just printing money that we have. It's like taking a charge card and charging it up and never paying it because you don't have any money. And that's basically the way it's working now.
Exactly.
And I was reading up on that by 2 or 3 different economists, which makes it look like that inflation is going to go even higher. And the only way to deflate it is depression in order to bring the dollar down.
Exactly. So really what we've got going on is a perfect storm. If you think about Revelation 6 and the... go ahead.
No, he's pointing at it. I didn't raise my hand.
So we've got really kind of a perfect storm, if you think about it, going on in terms of inflation in the economy. I think it's pretty well known that many people, a significant percentage of people in this country right now are, just barely making ends meet. And savings rates are pretty low. There's a lot of personal debt out there. And so as we see prices going up and, prices, inflation eating up what little is left and wages not keeping up with inflation, you can see how Revelation 6 and the day's wages for a loaf of bread, maybe that's a bit exaggerated in the near term, but ultimately it's going to be that way, how it can all take shape. And that's why I say I hopefully things stay the same or don't get worse, but it does make you wonder what things are going to be like a year from now or 2 years from now if the Lord tarries. As I've said for some time, when inflation becomes visible to the public and their pocketbooks take a hit, this is when the real crisis begins. And I think inflation is visible to just about everybody. A catch-22 situation arises, and the Fed must make a choice. To continue with inflationary programs and risk-taking, the blame for extreme price increases. Taper these programs and risk an implosion of stock markets. So one of the reasons the stock market keeps going up is that's the only place that this fiat money can go. You can't get interest on your money or anything else. So I think the stock market's being propped up by a lot of this fiat money that's been put into it. Without Fed support, stock markets will die. I believe the Fed is an ideological suicide bomber waiting to blow itself up and deliberately, I'm not saying that I agree with that it's a deliberate attempt. I'm not saying that I necessarily agree with that. That's what this guy is saying. Deliberately derail or destroy the American economy at the right moment. My position has also long been that bankers would need a cover event to hide their calculated economic attack. Again, I'm not saying I agree with that. The pandemic, subsequent lockdowns, and supply chain snarls have now provided that cover event. 2 years after the pandemic started, and the Fed has pumped out approximately $6 trillion more in stimulus and helicopter money through PPP loans and COVID checks. On top of that, Biden is ready to drop another $1 trillion in the span of the next couple of years through his recently passed infrastructure bill. Trillions of dollars in public work programs might create more jobs, but it will also inflate prices as the dollar goes into decline. So unless wages are adjusted constantly according to price increases, people will have jobs but still won't be able to afford a comfortable standard of living. This leads to stagflation. I don't know if you've heard a lot about stagflation and the potential for that lately, in which prices continue to rise while wages and consumption stagnate. Consumption stagnates because people can't afford to buy like they used to be able to. Another catch-22 to consider is that if inflation becomes rampant, the Federal Reserve may be compelled or claim they are compelled to raise interest rates significantly in a short span of time. This means an immediate slowdown in the flow of overnight loans to major banks, an immediate slowdown in loans to large and small businesses, an immediate crash in credit options for consumers, and an overall crash in consumer spending. The choice is stagflation or deflationary depression, like you just mentioned. It would appear the Fed has chosen stagflation, rising prices against declining or stagnant wages. We have now reached the stage of the game in which stagflation is becoming a household term, and it's only going to get worse from here on. Fed data, we are now witnessing the largest inflation surge in over 30 years, but the real story is much more concerning. This is something that you've talked about, Jack. The CPI numbers are manipulated and have been since the 1990s, when calculation methods were changed and certain unsavory factors were removed. If we look at inflation according to the original way of calculation, it is actually double that reported by the government today. In particular, necessities like food, housing, and energy have exploded in price, but we're only at the beginning, and those things are not included in the CPI indexes, which tells us that inflation is 5 or 6% or whatever. It's a facade, really. To be clear, the infrastructure bill and the pandemic stimulus are not the only culprits behind the stagflation. This has been a long time coming. It is a culmination of many years of central bank stimulus, sabotage, and multiple presidents supporting multiple dollar devaluation schemes. I'm not going to get into all of that. Collapse, this is the next session, is not too strong a word. I think most alternative economists have called the situation correctly in predicting a collapse. That doesn't mean it's going to happen next week or next month, but at some point, if we believe God's word, the economy will collapse. It has to, because the Bible says it will. This is often treated as a loaded term, the word collapse, but I don't know what else you could call the scenario we are facing. The COVID lockdowns and the battle over the vax mandates have perhaps distracted Americans from an even larger danger of financial instability. Some of the key policies within the literature of the Great Reset, which is all part of the World Economic Forum, and what the World Economic Forum calls the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I was just listening to Klaus Schwab last night giving a talk. He's the leader, the founder of the World Economic Forum. And that's exactly what he says. This Fourth Industrial Revolution is what's going to turn around or is ultimately going to result in this great world economic reset. And so this Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is tied into artificial intelligence and 5G and capabilities like that and so forth. And along the lines, I just heard today that Elon Musk says that their first brain implant or brain chip will be ready in 2022. And it has not necessarily nefarious intentions. It's supposed to help people with spinal cord injuries and things like that, so it may be good. But he said, they were hoping it would be available this year, but it's not. And he said it's worked very well so far, and monkeys and different animals that they've tested. So coming in the not-too-distant future, and apparently there are others that are working with things like that as well. to say nothing of certain agencies and countries recommending implants or chips being inserted in the head. I don't know if you've heard about that. Forehead and other places. Where else do you think it would be? Maybe the back of the right hand, perhaps? So all of this stuff that Revelation 13 talks about is being implemented and ready for the Antichrist who's going to come on the scene. Some of the key policies within the literature for the Great Reset and what the World Economic Forum calls the Fourth Industrial Revolution includes universal basic income, UBI. That's something that certain candidates on the Democrat side were advocating during the last election, during the primaries. Universal basic income, which is basically just giving everybody a certain amount of money month after month after month. And of course, you can see where that would head. That heads to government control. But there are those that believe that should happen. The sharing economy and eventually a global digital currency, that's going to come, that's on the way, using the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights basket as a foundation. Essentially, it would be a form of global technocratic communism. That's what this Fourth Industrial Revolution is designed to, one of the elements that will lead to that. To obtain such a system would require a catastrophe of epic proportions. The COVID pandemic gets the globalist part of the way there, but it's obviously not enough. COVID has not convinced many hundreds of millions of people around the world to give up their freedoms for the sake of security. And I think for some of the globalists, I think that's come as a bit of a surprise that people can get the vaccine, which is great and fine, but that doesn't mean you're going to take away our freedom. But But maybe a stagflationary collapse will accomplish what COVID has not. Accelerated price spikes in necessities, including housing and food, will generate mass poverty and homelessness. It's a pretty bleak article, but, we can take it for what it's worth, I guess. There's no chances that wages will keep up with costs, and they won't right now. I mean, we're not going to see wages going up 6-10% a year. It's just not going to happen. The government might step in with more stimulus to help major corporations and businesses increase wages. But this would basically be the beginning of a universal basic income or free money for everyone, and it would only cost more dollar devaluation and more inflation. So the precursor to UBI, Universal Basic Income, I think are all these giveaway programs that have been in place for the last couple of years. It's just kind of setting the stage for that, and which has led to millions of people not wanting to go to work, and everything else. It's just kind of like a snowball rolling down the hill. They could try to freeze prices as many communist regimes have in the past, but this only leads to increased manufacturing shutdowns because the costs of production are too high and the profit incentives too low. And don't think that can't happen. That you have politicians that think that they have all the answers, and we'll freeze prices. And you got companies that are barely making ends meet now, that their overhead is so high because of all of these price hikes and everything else, that would be a disaster. I suspect the establishment will bring back regular checks, like the COVID checks, for the public now struggling to deal with ever-increasing expenses and uncertainty, but with strings attached. Don't expect a UBI check, for example, if you refuse to comply with vax mandates. If you run a business, don't expect stimulus aids if you hire non-compliant workers. Universal income gives the government ultimate control over everything, and stagflationary crisis gives them the perfect opportunity to introduce permanent UBI. The mainstream can no longer deny the fact that stagflation is happening, and it's a threat. So hopefully those people that have not been educated on the situation will learn quickly enough to prepare for it. And however they can do that. So again, I was a little reluctant to read that, and it might be a little bit extreme, but I think as you just think about what this guy has written, we've heard the term stagflation. We know that consumer items are not included in CPI. We know that inflation, CPI in and of itself, is over 6% now. We know that millions of people aren't working. We have supply chain issues. I don't know if you've heard, but now there's a shortage of fertilizer. Have you heard that? And farmers are worried to death because they can't grow crops that we need without fertilizer. And it's a worldwide issue. Fertilizer is in short supply, and nobody seems to know the reason. Why is there a shortage of fertilizer?
Wasn't China one of the main manufacturers of it, and I think they've cut back? I heard something somewhere in regards to that.
Could be. I don't know what the reason is, but it's out there with everything else.
Go back to organic farming, and then they wouldn't be out.
Pardon me?
They could go back to organic farming.
Yeah.
You can't, because you can't have cows pooping anymore.
I know.
Oh, yeah, that's right, the methane problem.
So there goes the fertilizer.
So I mean, it's just all these different things that are coming together, and I want to check out something if I can. We read last. Pardon me? Written by Smith Activist Post. I'm not sure. It appears in a, I think, you get them, right? Yeah, get these. It's a prophecy updates that we get a couple times a week. I want to read something. If I can find it. Remember last week I read this thing from Prince Charles, and I was listening to Tom Hughes, I think it is, and he pointed something that went right over my head. I don't know if I can find it, that was included in his speech. This is the speech that Prince Charles, who's a major globalist, and I mean, when I say major globalist, he's one that believes in reducing the population and all these other really weird ideas that the most extreme globalists have. And as an aside, I don't know if you're interested, you can go to the World Economic Forum, and as part of that, they have what's called the Young Globalist University, and go through. There's 68 or 69 pages of people that have attended the Young Globalist University, and includes people like Mark Zuckerberg, Macron, Angela Merkel, a whole bunch of just all kinds of people from all over the world, industrial people, manufacturing people, world leaders. 64 pages. This is just those that have graduated from this university, and a lot of them from very left-leaning sounding organizations like, make the climate safer and all that type of stuff. But I'll see if I can find what he was referring to.
While you're looking at that, there was also a thing on England where they are talking about activating the negative interest rate for loans. And that was just within the last couple of weeks that I happened to read about that. They've talked about it before, and they're talking about it now.
How does that work? Does that mean you're going to say you need to take a loan?
No. Well,
But
for a short term, it's not a long term.
Happened in Japan 30 years ago.
yeah, they've had that before in other countries, where you actually have to pay a bank. You have to pay a bank to hold your money. Yeah, that's what that is.
Pay the bank.
You don't get any interest on your savings.
I guess it goes under my pillow.
Well, that's why you put it in the stock market, because that goes up with inflation.
I just called Jeff.
Yeah, it's good.
I put my head in the sand.
I can't find exactly what I'm looking for, and I don't want to try to remember it. I'll have to look for it. But somewhere in his speech, and I know that it's here somewhere, but it's something I have to look for. He refers to, it's going to, remember, he said it was going to take trillions and trillions of dollars to implement this new system, this new global enterprise, and that it will take millions of dollars so that I can't find it, it's in here somewhere, so that he can, it's for him to be able to accomplish all he's going to do, something like that. And the question is, who's the he that he's referring to? Could it be, somebody of such renown like an Antichrist or something like that? I don't know. I mean, obviously, we don't know who the Antichrist is, and he can't be revealed till the church is gone, but I'll look for it and make sure I find that for the next time we get together.
They found an article here on the fertilizer shortage, and it's because of a shortage of coal and natural gas, which is used to turn into ammonia, and through a chemical synthesis, urea is established, and that's a base for fertilizers. And China and Russia are the two of the biggest producers, and have restricted exports to ensure supplies for their own farmers. And there's a bunch more to this, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And then severe weather has suspended operations of Gulf Coast facilities that were used in the manufacture of it. So it looks like it's a bunch of different things that have all come together, resulting in this shortage.
Just one more thing, that's all. Yeah. I want to turn our attention back to Israel, if we could. A couple of articles, and this next article is kind of laughable because it goes against what God says. And the title of this article is, I don't know if you've read about this or heard about it, but the UN, the United Nations, has been anti-Israel from its inception. And the UN just passed a resolution, 129-11, that denied that Temple Mount holds significance from faiths aside from Islam. So this is a UN vote, 129-11, that said that the resolution passed 129-11 denied that the Temple Mount holds significance for faiths aside from Islam. So, and bear in mind that as we read in Numbers 23 and other places, that Israel is going to be alone in the world. And we can see that when it comes to some of the other things that are going on in terms of Iran and us trying to get back into the Iran treaty. But here's 129 of, I think, 170 nations in the UN or something. And, of course, most of them are Muslim nations, but they're saying that Jerusalem, Temple Mount, doesn't belong to the Jews, it belongs to them. In spite of the fact that if you read the Quran, there's not one single reference or mention of Jerusalem in the entire Quran. The only reference in there is what's called the Alaska, the Alaska, which became the Alaska Mosque, which is a mosque on Temple Mount. And then the Alaska is what's interpreted or translated to mean place of far-off worship. In other words, the two holiest sites for Islam are Mecca and Medina, both in Saudi Arabia. And the Quran mentions this other place called Alaska. Alaska means place of far-off worship. And Muslim tradition has it that Muhammad got on this steed, this horse-like thing, and it had like a peacock head, and it was a figment of somebody's imagination. And this steed carried him to Mount Moriah, which is where Temple Mount is, and from there he was elevated up to paradise where he had a conversation with Allah. Not specifically mentioned other than this third place. And it wasn't, interestingly, if you go back to 1924, that the Muslims came right out and said that Temple Mount, which is where the temple is, and is going to become a real hotbed of activity in the not too distant future, already is beginning to heat up. But that they clearly said at the beginning that Temple Mount was Jewish property, that Solomon built the first temple there. That's what the Muslims said as recently as, that's more than 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, that Temple Mount is a Jewish place. And it wasn't until 1950, or in the 50s, they began to turn that around. And now all of a sudden, Muslims, including the Palestinian Authority and others, are saying that is their third holiest site. It's a total figment. It's a total facade. It's a total lie. But yet you've got people, including the 129 nations, saying that Temple Mount doesn't hold any significance to Israel, that it's a Muslim holy place. It says the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution on Wednesday which called Temple Mount by its Muslim name, Harim el-Sharif. That's what the Muslim name is for Temple Mount, and downplayed the historical connection of the Jewish people to the holiest site in Judaism. And this, again, like I said, it's laughable. I'll read a couple of things in a moment, a couple of things from the Bible that God has to say about Temple Mount. Called the Jerusalem Resolution, the measure was passed 129 to 11 vote with 31 abstentions. The resolution said that those endorsing it were, quote, expressing grave concern over the continued closure of Palestinian institutions in the city, as well as acts of provocation and incitement, including by Israeli settlers, including holy. I'm not going to go into all of that, but just trust me, that's all propaganda. All propaganda. An American envoy to the UN said he voted against the measure, thankfully, due to its exclusionary nature. He says it's exclusionary by saying it's only in the interest of Muslims. But it does not acknowledge the significance the Temple Mount has to face other than Islam. In other words, he's okay with it being important to Islam, but because that's the exclusionary language of this resolution, it doesn't include Christianity and Judaism. If it had said it's significant for Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, he'd have been fine with it. It is morally, historically, and politically wrong for the Assembly to support language that denies both the Jewish and Muslim connections to the Temple Mount and Harim el-Sharif, he said. Now understand that when Solomon built the temple, he was David's son, and he built the temple and built it exactly as specified in the Jewish law and traditions. And it's the Jewish temple where the glory of God resided, called the Shekinah glory. That's where God's glory resided, and he resided with his people, Israel. And so from the beginning, it has been the holiest site for the holiest facility for Jewish people. And we'll talk a lot about the temple, because the temple is going to be, when you think about world events, Israel, if you look at a clock, Israel is the minute hand, or the hour hand, and Jerusalem's the minute hand, and Temple Mount will be the second hand. And that's really what everything's going to boil down to. So let me just read something, if I can find it here, in Ezekiel 5:5, to kind of put into perspective the significance of Jerusalem. And it's just simply a simple verse in Ezekiel chapter 5, verse 5, where it says, "This is what the sovereign Lord said." This is from Yahweh. "This is Jerusalem, which I have set at the center of the nations with countries all around her." So Jerusalem is often considered, and the center there in the original Hebrew language actually means navel. It's like belly button. It's in the center of the body. So Jerusalem is depicted by God as the center of the world. Everything revolves around Jerusalem and has for thousands of years. And if you think about, the Muslims saying that Temple Mount has no significance other than for Islam, I mean, the archaeological evidence alone is just overwhelming. It's a Jewish site, has been forever. Another article. United Nations celebrates Hanukkah with resolutions condemning Israel. Kind of the same thing, but maybe slightly different language. The UN's assault on Israel with a torrent of one-sided resolutions is surreal, said UN Watch Executive Director Halel Nuer, after 3 resolutions were passed on Wednesday. It's absurd that in the year 2021, out of 20 UN General Assembly resolutions that criticize countries, 70% are focused on one single country, Israel. 70% of the all the resolutions passed by the United Nations are anti-Israel. What drives these lopsided condemnations is a powerful political agenda to demonize the Jewish state. So we look into Deuteronomy 28 and other places, we'll see that's exactly what God said, that they would be restless and there would be no resting place for their head, that they would be hated by all nations. But yet, in spite of all that, God has protected and preserved them. One of the resolutions from Wednesday refers to Temple Mount, Judaism's holy site, only by its Muslim name. This is from the UN. Again, Haram al-Sharif. Another resolution solely puts the blame on Israel for the lack of peace in the Middle East and makes no mention of terrorist attacks and human rights violations by the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The resolutions were adopted 2 days after the United Nations held its inaugural International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people on November 29th. Nuer says France, Germany, Sweden, and other European Union states are expected to support almost all of the 14 resolutions against Israel. Now, I would suggest that Antichrist, when he is revealed, will likely come out of that part of the world. We know that from Daniel and other places. So isn't it interesting that the European Union, Germany, Sweden, and France, all support this resolution that says that Israel doesn't have an interest in Temple Mount? How can that be? How can it be? I'll tell you how it can be. If we read 1 John, chapter 5, and we talked a little bit about another verse along these same lines in 2 Corinthians a couple of weeks ago. 1 John, chapter 5, verse 19. And this is, I think, an important thing to bear in mind. Sometimes we tend to overlook this. If I can find it. Okay, chapter 5 of 1 John, verse 19. They're trying not to take things out of context, but here's what it says. We know, and this is a letter to Christians, to believers, so it's us, that we are children of God, and the whole world is under the control of the evil one. So what does that mean? That means that the world, the world institutions, the governments, everything related to this world is under Satan's control. He is in total control, which is why you see things like what we're seeing in the with the UN resolution and all of these anti-Israel votes, because it's satanic. It's absolutely satanic, because Satan has throughout history and will continue until Christ returns to do everything in his power to destroy Israel. That's what Iran says. I'll read a couple of quotes in a moment from one of the leaders in Iran, that their goal is to annihilate Israel. So ask yourself, how is it that you got Muslims in the world today, radicals, not all Muslims obviously, committed to the destruction of the annihilation of every single Jew on the face of the earth? Every single one.
And so why do they say that, besides what we just read, that Satan's in control, what do they say is the reason why they want to do that?
They don't give a reason, Okay. They don't. I mean, you listen to Iran and a couple of quotes I'll read in a moment. They don't really give a reason other than they're the Zionists, and Zionism, they use it in a pejorative way. They try to make it worse. All Zionism is a desire of the Jewish people to return to their homeland. That's all Zionism is. But you hear all these terms such as the Zionist this and the evil Zionists. All they want is their homeland back. That's it. But you have all of this, and they don't speak or explain why they want them annihilated, because they're under the control of Satan, I think. If they said we want to wipe them all out so that Jesus Christ doesn't come back, see, they don't even know. And as we read in 2 Corinthians 4, that people who are non-believers are under the influence of Satan. They're like putty in his hands. And so that's what we're seeing. There's a lot of that sort of thing. So,
to your point, earlier tonight I just opened my Bible up to Jeremiah 23. And 23 verses 7 and 8. And so then the days are coming, declares the Lord, when people will no longer say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the Israelites up out of Egypt, but rather they will say, as surely as the Lord lives, who brought the descendants of Israel up out of the land of the north and out of all the countries where they had been banished, then they will live in their own land. And so this move back to Israel, according to this, is God bringing the descendants back. That's why it becomes a satanic issue, because Satan needs to derail God's plans. And that's why it's so important for Satan to make sure that he attempts to make that happen. But according to Jeremiah 23 here, it says they will live in their own land.
Yeah.
Period. That's what it says.
So I have a couple of questions here from Tony. And Tony asks, can you discuss the falling away mentioned in Thessalonians and how, when that ties into end times and the rapture? All I can say, Tony, is we're a little short of time tonight, and that is a topic that we will discuss in the coming weeks. And then what are the similarities or differences between Jesus' end times discussions and Paul's letters? There's really no differences at all. They're all consistent, although Paul spends a lot more time talking about specific end times, although Jesus certainly talked about various things in the Olivet Discourse, but they certainly complement one another. So again, more on both of those topics later. We've heard that our current president, number 46, wants to re-enter the treaty with Iran, and that's the one that President number 44 entered into. It's an absolute disaster. Israel is begging them not to do it because what it means is that in order, if they do happen to get back into this Iran treaty of the United States and other nations, that Iran's not going to do it unless we lift the financial sanctions that have been imposed against them, which means they're going to have access to all kinds of finances and money and so forth. And also, it's built into the program that nobody is entitled to inspect their nuclear facilities. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. And we know, as we said last week, that we're very close to Iran's very close to having nuclear capabilities, weapon capabilities. So a couple of things here. Is the Vienna Talks. This is where the talks are supposed to take place. I don't know if it's going to happen. Hopefully, I know that Bennett, the president or the prime minister of Israel, has been talking to Secretary of State Blinken, trying to convince him that it's a big mistake to re-enter that treaty. So hopefully we don't do it. But if we do, that's just one more nail in the United States coffin. I can tell you that right now, because that's going against what God has said.
I thought the U.S. team had left and come back to the States because Iran was not at all serious about these discussions. Yeah. So maybe I misunderstood it, but I thought the talks were basically dead at this point.
I think they probably are. I think I have heard this. This is an article from 12/1, and I think things have happened since then. But I know that one of the things that the current administration wants is to re-enter that treaty. Now, maybe it's not going to work out. I don't see how it could work out, but here's the point I wanted to make. The Islamic Republic, which is Iran, has made it clear that no agreement can be discussed, let alone reached, unless all sanctions hindering the regime's operations are removed. It's also engaging in doublespeak, bragging about its strides in uranium enrichment, they're coming right out and saying it, on one hand, while insisting its nuclear program is for peaceful purposes on the other. It's not. And then it goes on to say, speaking of the regime-controlled Iran Students News Agency, Chief Iranian Army Spokesman Brigadier General Abfalasi Shenrek, I can't pronounce his last name, announced that this is from one of the leaders of Iran, who we want to enter into an agreement with, Israel's annihilation is his country's, quote, greatest ideal before us and greatest goal we pursue. And he goes on to say, we refer to the Zionists. Many think the occupying regime in Jerusalem, but we recognizing the occupying regime in Jerusalem is a tool for international Zionism. A lot of gobbledygook there, but what he's saying is that he's trying to make Zionism, the desire to have their own homeland, sound as though it's an evil plot. It's an evil plan. That's all it is. It started back in the 1800s, and it's when, in fulfillment of prophecy, God began to return the Jews to Israel. And that Jerusalem, that the regime, which means Israel, in Jerusalem is an occupier. That's a term that we hear a lot, is even on some of the mainstream media sites that we listen to, that the West Bank is occupied territory. What that means is, as long as there's one single Jew living there, it's occupied territory. It belongs to the Palestinians. No, it doesn't. God gave it to the Jewish people. So I wanted to just I got a pretty good book here that I want to read a couple of excerpts from. The title of the book is Escape the Global Storm. You ever heard of it?
Some unknown guy.
But here's just something I wanted to read from this book. And it's on page 101 of this book. And the topic is Temple Mount. And the author of this book, some 14 years ago, I guess, 13 years ago, wrote, Temple Mount, a 45-acre time bomb. That is just powerful, isn't it?
Genius.
So,
Unbelievable.
I just I'd like to meet this guy.
I know. Tell our international brothers that are watching and sisters that are watching now where they can buy that book.
Well, I don't know. Okay.
I got a copy. Yeah.
David's son Solomon expanded the area of Jerusalem northward to include Mount Moriah, where, at God's direction, he built the temple upon what we know today as the Temple Mount. As recorded in 1 Kings 9:3, quote, "The Lord said to him, I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there," what? Forever. So when these nations say that that the temple doesn't have anything to do with Israel, who are they going against? And they don't even know it. The Israelites worship God and atone for their transgressions by making their offerings and sacrifices in the temple. It was the main gathering place in Israel during the Jewish holidays, and it was the center of religious Jewish worship. It housed the Holy of Holies, which contained the Ark of the Covenant. It was a place where God's presence was experienced. God said to Solomon, quote, and this is in 1 Kings 6:12 and 13, "As for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, carry out my regulations, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to David your father. And I will live among the Israelites and not abandon my people Israel." The word Shekinah is often used to describe the glory of God that was present in the temple. The word Shekinah doesn't appear in the Bible, but it's a transliteration of a Hebrew word that means the one who dwells, or that which dwells. So one of the things that happened is that after Solomon built the temple and it was consecrated and dedicated and so on and so forth, God's glory literally resided there. So if you ever saw the movie The Ark of the Covenant, it tried to kind of capture how dangerous it was to go in there, to be in the presence of God. And it was such that once a year, the high priest would go in and atone for the sins of the people on an annual basis. It was so dangerous because the glory of God was there that they had to literally tie a rope around it so they could bring him out. But if he hadn't been cleansed and washed and gone through all the purification required of the high priest, he literally could die in there because God's presence was there. And then finally the Jews became, their offerings became so just kind of rote-like. They became automatic. There was no meaning behind their offerings in the temple, that the glory actually lifted and left. And so the second temple, and before the destruction of the first temple, the Shekinah glory was gone. It was no longer there. But we know that glory is going to return to the temple. And it's going to enter the eastern gate of the whatever temple is on Temple Mount at that time. And what do we think is going to happen? What is that glory going to be? It's when the Lord Jesus Christ comes back. And after he goes through some things he's going to do, but he's going to enter that temple through the eastern gate, probably the fourth temple. There's a third temple yet to be built. Then there'll be a fourth temple during the kingdom age. And that Jesus is going to return. So it talks about the glory leaving. It's never returned, and it won't return, but when it does, it'll return through Jesus Christ. He is the Shekinah glory. It's going to return and rededicate the temple. And it's there where Jesus is going to rule and reign from for the entire millennial kingdom. He's going to rule from Jerusalem in a brand new temple, sitting on Temple Mount in Jerusalem. It's not going to be an Arab or a Muslim shrine. It's going to be for all people in the world at that time to visit. But he is going to come back there. The Temple Mount is this is a quote from a fellow by the name of Solomon, who is the founder and chairman of a group called the Temple Mount and Land of Israel Faithful. It's an organization committed to rebuilding the temple. He said, quote, "The Temple Mount is the reason for Jewish existence. When the Temple Mount is removed from the Israeli people, then the heart of Israel is plucked out. And this author, back in 14 years ago, wrote the following. Powerful stuff. The Muslims maintain that they will never relinquish control of Temple Mount. During the Camp David talks in 2000, then Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat made the outrageous claim that Temple Mount was never home to either the first or second Jewish temples. I mean, that's what he said. He also claimed that he was born in a house just outside of Temple Mount, when we know for a fact he was born in Egypt, where he stayed until he was about 19 years old. So he was the father of terrorism and the father of a lot of other things. It was reported in the Washington Times on December 4th, 2002, that Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, and he's still there, Hassan Nasrallah is the leader of Hezbollah, stated, "By Allah, if they, the Jews, touch Al-Aqsa, Temple Mount, we will act everywhere around the world." He went on to say, "Jews have no right whatsoever to Al-Aqsa Mosque, compound, and platform all of the Temple Mount, according to our Islamic teachings, creed, history, and heritage." We may not hear much about Temple Mount today, but that will change with time. 14 years ago. It will most likely take center stage at some point during peace talks between the Palestinians and Israel. That's probably not going to happen now. This tiny, seemingly insignificant piece of real estate is sacred to Muslim, Christians, and Jews. Tensions over the Temple Mount are sure to increase, forcing the international community, maybe the UN, for example, to become involved, likely in support of the Palestinians. 119 to 17, or whatever it was, votes, which in turn will exacerbate the conflict. Whether or not the status of Temple Mount leads directly to Armageddon remains to be seen, but is sure to contribute significantly to Middle East tensions, which already are high, and that's 14 years ago. So, a lot going on. I don't know if anybody's listened to Amir lately, but tensions between Iran and Israel have never been higher. They could go to war. How that fits in with Ezekiel's prophecy remains to be seen. But then there was just an explosion last week at the Natanz nuclear site in Iran. And Iran said it was a misguided missile or something, or an intended explosion, but you can be pretty sure that Israel was behind that in some fashion. Israel's Mossad, which is like our CIA, is second to none, and so they have something to do with that for sure. So. Again, Temple Mount, we'll drill down, talk more about it, but that is going to become a true hotbed of activity and probably going to initiate an awful lot more. Next week, we'll take a peek at Zechariah 13 or Zechariah 12, which talks about just how significant Jerusalem is, and see where we go from there. Questions, comments?
As I was talking to you about before, those of us been in this program for a while now. Years ago, we always talked about things that were going to happen in the future, and we always talk about prophecy, what's going to happen. In this short of time, we're living in it. Now we're talking about things that are happening today, right now in this world, that we're learning about in this class and relating to Bible prophecies. And yeah, even your book, everything is in what's going to happen in the future. Well, the future's here. It's happening now.
I think if I hold on to that book for 50 years, if we still are around.
Do you know how
much it's going for?
There's one copy available on the web right
I
now.
bought one on the.
$199.99.
I'll sell this for $150.
And it's autographed.